but I personally did not practice 4 hours a day consistently ever. It didn't feel to me like that was even valuable and that I was getting good returns on my time. What I did was that I would practice an hour and a half a day maybe. I actually had a really clear plan every day that I practiced of what I wanted to do to get better. I wanted to see by the end of the hour and a half that I had improved in some very tangible way.
Alright, hello and welcome back to Confident Musicianing. Oh my gosh, am I excited for this episode because we are in for a treat. We are speaking with Maestro Jacob Joyce today. Maestro is the Associate Conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, the Music Director of the Pittsburgh Youth Symphony Orchestra. He is the former Resident Conductor of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra and has worked with several orchestras including the Detroit, St. Louis, Houston, Colorado, Florida, Ann Arbor, and Baton Rouge Symphonies. He has also conducted the London Symphony Orchestra, the NDR-Sinfonieorchester, the HR-Sinfonieorchester Frankfurt, and the Frankfurt Museumsorchester. He was awarded the Salty Career Assistance Award in 2020, and he is the host and creator of a podcast called Attention to Detail, the Classical Music Listening Guide. He has a bachelor from Yale in music and economics and a master's in violin performance from Yale. Isn't that crazy? Like, that's amazing. Oh my gosh. Hello, Maestro. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you, Eleanor?
I am doing great. I am so excited to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
I am delighted to be here. I'm glad to see that you've been undertaking this great endeavor of doing this podcast, and any student in the youth orchestra who is doing something to further the audience for classical music, I am very happy to support. So glad to see that you've been doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. That is so lovely. Let's dive right into some stuff that we can talk about. You have done so many things in your career already, from conducting the LSO to the NDR-Sinfonieorchester to the Indianapolis Orchestra and everything in between. To get all of these opportunities, you must have had some strong networking skills. So what are the top things that you are doing when you're networking to get these opportunities, and how do you go about doing them?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the trickiest things about the classical music world in general, and I think this is probably true of many industries, not just classical music, but it's a real challenge to get opportunities, and like you said, putting yourself out there and having a good network that you establish and continue to build is really important. I have found, however, that the thing that speaks most strongly to people in the classical music world and is the most powerful networking tool is actually doing really high quality work and having people see you do that. And so networking is certainly important, and when people think about networking, I think they think about talking to as many people as possible and making connections and contact with people, which is it can be valuable, I think, but given that there are so many people who want to do this as a living and are putting their name out there, the best networking I've always felt is people actually seeing your work and seeing you do good work, and then word of mouth. And so, I think the opportunities for networking that are most important are whenever you have an actual performance or a rehearsal or something that you are doing in a public forum where you can actually invite people to attend or something like that, because it's always more powerful if they see you in action as opposed to you just making a verbal or electronic connection with someone. And so that, I think, is what I've tried to rely on is people actually seeing the work that I do as much as possible.
Wow, yes. That makes so much sense. And I mean, to me personally, I think I think I didn't really think about that like that before, but definitely kind of getting your work out and being, I guess, on the ball for every time you practice and every time you play, even if it's just in something small. I think that can create really good opportunities. That's really interesting. Do you have any like real life examples that you can think of that has happened to you?
Yeah, yeah. I think one thing that's important to remember for people is also that you never know who is in the audience and who might be listening. And when you're starting, especially, I think it's very common that you're performing for quite small audiences, or sometimes at least, and it feels like, you might have a recital at school or whatever it might be, and there's only a few people there. But every single person who's there, who is in the classical music world, is a potential connection or networking opportunity that, like you said, it's you want to be on your highest level all the time, because that that kind of momentum that you build in people's minds can compound on itself. And so, yeah, there are countless examples, I think, of the majority of the work that I've gotten, the stuff that you cited at the beginning of like the orchestras that I've conducted and things like that, all of that has come from word of mouth or people actually seeing a performance. I've never actually emailed an orchestra and said, here are my credentials, would you hire me? At least, that's never how an engagement really comes about.
Mm-hmm.
It's all from people hearing from someone else or seeing for themselves the quality of the work that you've done that really makes them reach out and hire you to do something. And so I think what you said is really important, that you always want to be on the ball as much as possible, and never think of a performance that you have as just, there's not that many people going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
There's not that many, there's no one from the industry who's coming to check me out, so I don't need to be on my A game. There always could be someone there who might make a difference down the line. And so I think that's really important to remember.
That's fascinating. I actually, when you were saying that, I remember one time I was doing what's it called? A rehearsal. I was doing a rehearsal at an accompanist's apartment, and I didn't know, but her roommate runs chamber groups, and her roommate heard me in the rehearsal, and then I got an email saying, do you want to join a chamber group? So I think it's so true of like, just be on your best behavior in terms of playing as you can at all times. Yeah. So really, really interesting. Let's talk a little bit about you studying violin and you studying conducting. Because making the change from studying violin at Yale and then conducting seems like a big transition. I mean, for me, I will be making the transition from a long scrape oboe reed to a short scrape oboe reed when I go and study in the UK. But you changed from one instrument to another completely different position in an orchestra, which is, to me, like a huge transition. So why, like, what created you, or what, I guess, pushed you to make that decision? Why did you make it? And to anyone listening who might be interested in making a big switch like that, what are some things that you would want to say to them?
So the reason why I ultimately made the switch was because I felt for a number of years before I actually fully made the switch that I was really interested in conducting. And like when I started violin when I was a very little kid, I had this passion for violin where it was the thing that really felt like the thing that I loved most in the world to do, and I was motivated to practice, and I listened to a lot of music, especially violin playing, and I had that fascination and curiosity that you associate with being really passionate about something. And at some point in high school, around then, it kind of evolved for me to feeling that way about conducting, or at least about orchestral repertoire. And so I got really interested in orchestral repertoire and the idea of conducting, and once you have that bug or that itch, I think it's very, it's like anyone who wants to follow their passion. If you really feel strongly about it and you don't want to be denied the opportunity to do that, then you really feel like you need to go for it. And so I think the thing that gave me the confidence to really make a switch, which was admittedly a very big switch and a big gamble on my future and my future in the music world, was the fact that I really felt like I would be unhappy or unfulfilled if I didn't fully go for it, because this is what I really, really wanted to do. And even when you have that feeling, I think it takes a lot of confidence to fully pull the trigger and say, I'm gonna make this switch. But and as a result, I kind of eased into it. I kept playing violin, and I think I wouldn't ever encourage someone to just cold turkey completely alter their career path if there's a lot of uncertainty there. But I do think, if there's something that you're really passionate about and you really want to go for, and you feel like you have that drive and that ability to outwork everybody else because you just love it so much, then I am a firm believer that it's worth it to take that leap and try to make a big switch like that if it's the right thing for you. I think what's important is that you really have to feel like you couldn't do anything else, because you need that kind of fire to encourage you to keep working, keep practicing, keep studying, so that you can always be on the very top of your game.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you were talking about you needing to feel like if you didn't make the switch, you would feel like you're missing out on something. I definitely feel that way in terms of long scrape reeds and short scrape reeds. I'm currently playing a long scrape reed, and I will be transitioning. And when I was trying to make that decision, that definitely came into play. I was like, if I stay on the long scrape, I'll feel like I'm going to miss out on the short scrape. And so that is part of the reason why I've decided to make the switch. So yeah, that's really, really, really interesting. Talking a little more about university and that time, you were also studying economics as well as music. And when I read that about you, I was like, whoa, I had absolutely no idea. So why did you decide to study both music and then something outside of music? And how has studying economics informed your music career throughout your life?
I think the main reason that I studied econ particularly was just that I had a real secondary interest in it. I took a lot of classes my first year, and I was curious to see what I would actually be interested in, and I particularly enjoyed my economics classes. And so then, for me, I was more motivated to try to get some proficiency in something other than music and take some higher level classes that demanded a little bit more specialized knowledge. I had the opportunity to, because I was majoring in music, I didn't have to progress far in any other field in college to complete a major, and so I could have just taken a lot of introductory courses, and sometimes I wish I had done a little bit more of that. But I do think there was something about economics and working hard, just like I had been trained since I was a young kid in the music world to work at something for an extended period of time and hone a craft. I kind of wanted to do that with some academic discipline, and so I did that with econ. But I will say, I don't know how much my econ per se has informed my musical career, but I do think that more broadly, studying something other than music and really just being academically curious and motivated and continuing to read and learn, that is something that has, I think, benefited me enormously. I think it's a really important element of being a well-rounded musician, a well-rounded colleague, a collaborator. You know, in conducting particularly, but this is true for all musicians, there's a lot of interpersonal skills, managerial skills, social skills, and not just kind of social skills in the more colloquial sense, but kind of sociological skills that you really need to have. And so I think having thought critically and having the ability to think critically and having developed that in some academic discipline outside of music is really horizon broadening and gives you a better platform to navigate what is going to be a very multifaceted career regardless of what you do in music. And so I think for me, that's been really valuable as well. Just not so much maybe econ per se, but the fact that I continue to study, continue to read, and I do so today. I recently have been kind of more interested in English and literature and reading, catching up on some reading that I feel like I missed in my college days, and I feel like that benefits me in some way. I'm not sure exactly how to quantify it, but just continuing to be curious, I think, is something that it really has helped my music making.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially staying curious and focusing on something outside of music. I feel like a lot of like, I guess, the vibe or the feeling about if you're going to study music, you have to study music, and music is your whole life, and if you have any interests outside of music, then you're a bad musician. And I feel like a lot of people might think about that, but it's definitely not true. Like, we're just humans and we're people, and we're interested in things, and music is one of them, and that's what we want to make our career out of. But it's perfectly fine to be interested in something else. I think one of the things that maybe student musicians who are thinking about maybe studying music as well as something else, one of the things that they might be thinking about is, can I take on that load? Because music is a lot, but then adding something else completely different is also a lot. So to any of the listeners who might be feeling that way or might be thinking about making that choice, but they're still kind of a little unsure, do you have anything to say to them?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, it's really important. I think what you said about the vibe around musicians not having to focus exclusively on music, I think that's totally misguided. And so if people feel that way, it's important to not succumb to that kind of peer pressure or whatever it might be. I think it is really important in your kind of formative years, if you want a career in classical music and especially in performance. It's true, and it's always going to be a truism of the classical music world that you're going to have to practice a lot and really achieve a high level of technical and musical proficiency. And so to get a job, it is true that you just have to put in a lot of time, and you have to work at your craft to really get good at just the fundamentals that I think people don't really stress enough. You have to be able to play in tune, you have to play with a good sound, you have to be able to technically execute passages that are required of your instrument. And so those things, that takes a lot of time and a lot of practice. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think one of the biggest issues for young musicians is that they don't practice particularly efficiently. And so I never understood personally. I mean, I know everyone's a little bit different, and people take different amounts of time to learn things, but I personally did not practice 4 hours a day consistently ever. It didn't feel to me like that was even valuable and that I was getting good returns on my time. What I did was that I would practice an hour and a half a day maybe, but I actually had a really clear plan every day that I practiced of what I wanted to do to get better. And it wasn't just going through the motions or playing stuff. I wanted to see by the end of the hour and a half that that was like worth my time. I hadn't just burnt 4 hours in a practice room, and I had improved in some very tangible way. And so I do think I practiced comparatively very efficiently, and that gave me some extra time to do all this other stuff. And I think that more musicians have that ability than maybe they give themselves credit for. I think if you can, you don't want to be hard on yourself, but you just want to look at your practice sessions really objectively and say, am I really maximizing the use of my own time? And if there are areas that you can expedite the process, or you're focusing too much on things that are really not helping you with those fundamentals of, am I just getting better at my instrument? Then maybe it's worth reworking a little bit, because you want that time to do other things.
That's really fascinating. I mean, personally, for me, I'm trying to do that every single practice session, and sometimes it's really good, and I get out of a practice session, I'm like, that was amazing, and then other times I'm like, I don't really know what happened. Do you have any examples of really good practice sessions, or any tips on making really good practice sessions and staying consistent with your focus?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, it's never going to be the case. It's not going to be, your progress is never going to be linear, and there are going to be days when it doesn't go well. But I think, what you can control ultimately is your plan for what you're going to do to try to get better that day, and really sticking to it. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, the one thing that is also really interesting about, and I think it's a phenomenon that happens to a lot of people when they practice, is that your perception of your practice session and how something went often varies considerably from objectively how it might have actually been. When you're your own musician, you're in the practice room with yourself every single day. You get to know exactly how you sound. The tiniest little details can affect your perception of how you're sounding, how your practice session went, how an audition went. I see that all the time from people in auditions, whether it's for youth orchestra or professional orchestras, regardless of the level. People have a very strong sense. People will say, oh, this was a great audition. Oh, this was a disaster. Oh, I played really well. Oh, I played terribly. And for them, they feel like there's this big window of or kind of spectrum of possibilities that their playing could fall under. They could have a really good day, and that's 100 out of 100, or they could have a really bad day, and that's 0 out of 100. But for anyone who hasn't been there in the practice room with them every day, that spectrum is so much smaller, because they play at a certain level. That's what you hear immediately, whether they're on their best day or their worst day. And so that feeling internally is just so much more heightened than it comes across to anyone else. And so I think that's, one thing that I tried to keep in mind whenever I was practicing was that, there are great days. There are days where you feel like you sound great. There are days where you feel like you don't sound so good. Maybe the room you're playing in that day sounds better or worse or whatever. But how can I just bring it back to, okay, here's 2 things that I want to get better at. I'm not going to move on until I do them. And if you just break it down in that sense, and you're not kind of thinking so much about, how am I sounding today? Am I where I want to be? Then you can just take those slow but steady steps. And I think, that's a really tough phenomenon to get over, the kind of internal okay, here's how I sound, and there's this wide range, but it's so important for auditioning.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is fascinating. I think, I mean, at the end of the day, we are human, so we do have bad practice days. But yeah, just getting the overall level to just get higher and higher and higher. I think that is just so valuable to maybe even just hear from someone else, and just be, I guess, validated in that sense of, we have bad practice days, and that's fine. We're just focusing on focusing and just slowly getting better, but it is okay to have an off day or two. Many of our listeners are also going to be doing auditions for various different ensembles and programs, whether that's like university or youth orchestra. When you audition, what are your top 3 things that you do beforehand to prepare?
Oh, top 3 things that I do beforehand. Well, I mean, I think, on the day of, I try to not over practice or over prepare so that there's a little bit of that feeling of freshness. Both, there's a little bit of kind of, okay, I haven't played this 20 times already today, so I'm bored, internally and externally, that you're playing with a little bit of energy and excitement because you haven't already played that 20 times before in the day. Now I perform a lot more than I audition, to be honest, and so I think more about my performance practices beforehand. But I just try to take a minute or two. It's not really meditating per se, but I try to, before I go on stage, every time I go on stage, I try to just kind of clear my head for 1 or 2 minutes and not think about anything, because I read somewhere this study on focus and the ability to maintain this really, really high level of focus that I think we all know as musicians, especially when you get into some sort of flow state, that can be really taxing on your brain, and you can't actually maintain that for particularly long periods of time. And so if you do a little kind of, and it's been shown that, if you kind of clear your head and you're not really thinking about anything actively, that's a good relaxation for your brain, to restore the ability to really focus on that high level. And so I try, before I go on stage, to just for a couple of minutes really clear everything out, and sometimes I even lie down and close my eyes and just take 2 minutes to reset the brain so that I can click it on and then really be focused. So yeah, I think that those are some of my kind of pre-audition or performance rituals. In the actual audition or performance, what we were talking about just a second ago, I think that's the most important thing for me, is that, and you get better at this with age and with experience performing, but especially early on, it's just so important to not kind of sabotage yourself by feeling like you are having a bad day. Like, I think that's something that's just so important is, if you start an audition or if you're warming up and you feel like, okay, it's not going well today, that you don't get overly hung up on that, because like I said, it never ever comes across to the panel, to the committee, whoever is listening to you, even close to the level that it feels like internally of how good or bad this is going. And I can tell you, I tell this to everyone, the level of someone's performance on a particular day is so infrequently the deciding factor that wins them the audition or loses them the audition. That has been taken care of so much before they even get into the audition room. They're playing at a level, and I listen to Paiso auditions all the time, and I know certain kids, you can tell they just feel like, oh, that went terribly, oh, this went well. But the reality is that all of it was done before they even stepped into the room, because they're playing at a certain level, they've practiced at that certain level. And so given that that's the case, I think it's really important for people to just not to try to not worry so much in the actual audition about how it's going and
Mm-hmm.
just play, because it always feels way more dramatic to yourself than it actually is to the people listening.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interesting. That reminds me of I recently just did an audition for something, and I kind of had a realization beforehand because I was nervous. It was for something big and important, and I was nervous and I was like, "Oh, is it going to go well?" And then I realized that's not my responsibility if I like win or lose. That's the panel's responsibility. My responsibility is to play and have fun and enjoy it. I don't have to decide who wins. So that in my head, because I was thinking like, okay, if you do this, then you'll be more closer to winning, or if you do this, then you'll definitely have not won. And my mind was like, that's not my call. That's not my responsibility. I'm gonna focus on what I can control, and it's their responsibility, the panel, to listen and make a decision. I do not make that decision for myself beforehand, and that really helped me to play really well in that audition. So that's really interesting, kind of what you were touching on there. Talking a little more about, I guess, younger musicians, you have worked with youth orchestras throughout your career, and you have experience working with younger musicians. And on the whole, throughout your experience with younger musicians and seeing how, on the whole, younger musicians play and maybe the things that they struggle with, what are a few things that younger musicians could work on or focus on throughout their development, or anything that you want to say to those younger musicians who might be listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things certainly is just having a love for music. I think if the students that I always like working with the most are the ones who are enthusiastic, who want to be there, and who are curious about music and excited to play. I've never understood why people do this if they don't love it, because it's such a demanding thing. It's so you need to practice a lot, and so and especially for younger people, it's try. I think it's important to try to find the thing about music that you're particularly interested in, whatever that might be, and taking the initiative to research it, to be curious about it, to learn more about it. That actually goes a really, really long way in your playing as well as your general musicianship. If you just have that curiosity and that passion for making music, by no means that you need to be someone who's interested in going into music for the rest of your life. I think most of the people that I work with who are kids, I wouldn't even encourage them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But what I always enjoy seeing from people is if they get something out of it, that's really stimulating to them and allows them to be creative and curious. And so that's important. I think, technically speaking, there are some things that young musicians do frequently that, if you can avoid, will instantly take you to a much higher level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of it comes down to having an awareness, and the ability to listen to people around you. You spend a lot of time in a practice room as a young musician. And so if you're practicing your orchestra music, if you're practicing chamber music, whatever it might be, you're not always learning what else is going on around you. And if you go to a rehearsal with an orchestra like the Pittsburgh Symphony, the speed at which the players adapt to things that are going on around them is staggering, and it's incredibly impressive. They know the pieces and everything that's going on around them so well, so that a lot of these mistakes that young people make just don't happen, like rushing, like missed entrances, like playing way too loudly or way too softly in a non-balanced way, not matching the stylistic tendencies of your colleagues. These are things that are, a lot of young musicians here don't rush, don't drag, whatever it might be. But so much of that is just an element of listening to who's playing the primary voice at this moment, who has the driving rhythm at this moment, and listening. And if you do that, then you can't rush, because you're following someone else. You're playing with them. And so I think that is a thing that's really important for young musicians. If you can expand your knowledge of what is going on around you and have the ability not only to play but also to listen, so many of the technical mistakes that people make, rushing, even intonation, adapting to the intonation around you, so important. And you don't always get that in your practice room. So listening, practicing listening in orchestra and chamber music, I think that's the most important thing that instantly shows to me that someone is a really intelligent and advanced musician, is if they have the ability to do that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's really, really insightful. I will try and listen more in orchestra rehearsal.
There you go. That's good. Well, everybody can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, we can. Yeah, definitely. Maestro Joyce, you are the associate conductor of the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. Let's talk about that. What are some upcoming concerts that people can look out for with the PSO? This episode will be released either next week or the week after. So, like, end of April, early May. What is going on with the PSO?
Well, the PSO, I mean, one thing that's great about the Pittsburgh Symphony is that basically every week we have some world-class performance going on. I have a lot of concerts this summer, so if there are people in Pittsburgh and they want to, if they want to come see one of my concerts, one of the benefits of my job is that I get to do a lot of different styles of concerts and repertoire. So, ranges from everything. This summer, I have kind of a full classical program that has Mendelssohn Italian Symphony on it, and a number of other pieces. And then the week before, I think I'm conducting Star Wars with the movie, Episode 7. So it very kind of varied types of concerts, which I really love, because I love conducting classical music. Like, straight classical music is my favorite, and that's what I ultimately love, and the reason why I got into this. But conducting movies with the film is also something that I've grown to really love, because it's incredibly challenging, and so those are fun as well, and everything in between. So there are a number of concerts coming up this summer that I'm doing with the PSO, but more importantly, it's just and really, one of the great things about the living in the U.S. is this way, but also, of course, the U.K. and all of continental Europe is the same. There are so many good orchestras now that basically in every city there's some high-level symphony orchestra just up the street, and almost all of those orchestras have really affordable tickets for students, and so it's something that I always encourage people to do, is just you should just go listen, because that's also the way that you learn better than anything else. And so sitting there and just listening is one of the best things you can do to improve your playing. So that's what I encourage people to do.
Yeah, 100%. So if you are in Pittsburgh, the link to the PSO will be in the show notes in the description. And if you are not in Pittsburgh, we highly encourage you to go and see the symphonies nearby, because I mean that can be such a huge help for practicing, especially if, like, I mean, it's an amazing opportunity when there's a soloist of your instrument in town, and you can see that and really gain some knowledge about your instrument from that. So yeah, definitely. Maestro, you are also the owner and the host of the podcast Attention to Detail, the Classical Music Listening Guide, which I am such a fan of. When I was doing some research, I found this podcast. I had no idea that you had this podcast, and I listened to a few episodes, and it's just packed with amazing information. So if you were to sum up for our listeners your podcast, what it's about, how would you go about doing that?
Well, that's very kind of you. The podcast is really about, it's especially for kind of non-musicians or people who are a little bit less experienced listening to classical music, but it's all about listening to classical music, and some techniques that I and my co-host developed, can't even say developed, but just kind of try to highlight around listening to classical music and trying to develop an appreciation for listening, for people for whom this might be a little bit of a foreign language. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea is really, I've always believed that people have a really strong internal faculty of musical cognition and ability, and mm-hmm. the ability to listen, and they can unlock that just like you unlock the faculty for speaking a language by doing it. And so, to build fluency in listening to music, people just really have to do it with kind of an open mind, and like you have when you're trying to learn a new language. Mm-hmm. So those are what the techniques in the podcast are really about, is just how to approach listening to something that might sound very foreign, but in a way that might kind of engender further appreciation down the road.
Yes, 100%. So that podcast episode, or the link to the podcast, will be in the show notes, in the description. We are just about finished. All right, that is about it for our conversation with Maestro Jacob Joyce. Maestro, thank you so much. Where can people find you online?
If they want to find me online, they can go to my website. I think it's jacobjoyceconductor.com. But more importantly, if they want to listen to the podcast, that's on Apple and Spotify and everywhere. They can find me at the PSO. Like we said, lots of concerts coming up. So I thank you so much for everyone listening, and it was a joy to be on the podcast, and again, congrats to you, Eleanor, for doing this and taking the initiative to spread the word about classical music.
Thank you so much. That's so lovely to hear you say that. To our listeners, thank you so much for listening. As always, all the stuff to do with this episode will be linked in the show notes, in the description, from the link to the PSO, to Maestro's website, to the link for the podcast. Make a habit of doing yourself a favor and looking at those show notes, because let's be honest, there is some good stuff in there. And if you want to show your love and support for the Confident Musicianing podcast, make sure you give it a follow. All right, well, Maestro, thank you so much for speaking with us. I am so grateful that you took the time out of your day to do that, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Me too, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.